General George J. Stannard is often known as the first Vermonter to volunteer. This is because, actually, the day the governor of Vermont called for troops, he telegrammed the governor saying he would volunteer, which, you know, not many people were able to do that, so he's the first Vermonter to volunteer. In June 1861, he was made lieutenant colonel of the 2nd Vermont Infantry Regiment. Following this, he served at the First Battle of Bull Run, where he was offered a full colonelcy of the 3rd Vermont. He, however, declined, feeling that he hadn't earned it yet. Then, at the Battle of Fort Magruder, he secured a river crossing that was sufficient enough that General Hancock mentions his actions in his report. This, of course, was during the Peninsula Campaign, which lasted from March 1862 to the end of the 7 days on July 1st, 1862. Immediately after the campaign, Stannard was made full colonel in command of the 9th Vermont Infantry Regiment. By September 2nd, the 9th was part of the garrison at Harper's Ferry. Although the first skirmishing began on September 12th, Stannard and the 9th didn't see action until the 13th in defense at the Battle of Bolivar Heights. And they, along with nearly the entire 14,000-man garrison, were captured on September 15th, with a total of 12,419 Union troops captured by Stonewall Jackson in the Battle of Harper's Ferry. Now, Stannard, being an officer, was exchanged in January of 1863, at which time he was allowed to return to Vermont for recuperation, and March 11th, same year, he was promoted to brigadier general. Then, in April, Stannard went to D.C. to take command of the 2nd Vermont Infantry Brigade. This brigade was composed of the 12th through 16th Vermont Infantry Regiments. Oh, I should clarify here, the 2nd Vermont Brigade is fresh troops. They've basically only done guard duty outside D.C. So, fresh troops. Following the Confederates crossing the Potomac, the 2nd Vermont was ordered to leave D.C. and join the main body of the Army of the Potomac. They marched north beginning June 25th, and by June 30th, they've reached the supply hub of Westminster. I should note here, not the Abbey, of course. I'm talking about the city in Maryland, which I hate driving in. However, after a night's rest, the march north continued, but without the 12th and 15th regiments, as they were left behind to guard supplies and wagon trains and such. Stannard, along with the 13th, 14th, and 16th Vermont regiments, which hereafter I will refer to as the Vermont Brigade, I will be ignoring the 2 regiments of the brigade that are not with them. If I say brigade, I mean the main body of the brigade. That being said, the 2nd Vermont Brigade reached the outskirts of Gettysburg late July 1st. By that time, the fighting was done for the day. However, at that point, they were given to the 1st Corps, specifically the 3rd Division, as the majority of fighting the first day had been done by, well, the cavalry, but infantry-wise, it had been done with the 1st and 11th Corps. And they both took losses, and they needed to have any gaps filled, so their losses were replaced partially with the 2nd Vermont Brigade. The second day began with the 2nd Vermont Brigade behind Cemetery Hill. They see no action that morning. Then in the afternoon, the 14th and 16th regiments are used to plug gaps on the left flank of Cemetery Hill. I get those mixed up. When speaking, I know what they are, but verbally I mix it up. The 13th Regiment, meanwhile, engaged Brigadier General Ambrose Wright's Georgians, where they managed to recapture 20 cannons that had been captured by Wright. Additionally, Company A of the 13th captured 80 Alabamans at the Codori farmhouse. For this, Captain John Longerin received the Medal of Honor, with a citation reading, for gallantry in the recapture of 4 guns and the capture of 2 additional guns from the enemy. Also the capture of a number of prisoners. July 2nd ends with the 16th Regiment being posted as pickets along the Emmitsburg Road. At first light on July 3rd, the Confederates give a rousing alarm by firing a few shells towards the Union line. They, of course, overshoot the 16th. However, one of the shells hits an ammunition wagon behind the 14th. This leads to shrapnel flying, and the 14th takes a few casualties. Stannard then requests and receives permission to move the 13th and 14th forward 100 yards. This brings them onto slightly lower ground, which protects them from any more artillery. Specifically that lower ground right there, you can see a little dip so the shells would go over more. There isn't much more artillery. The rest of the morning is pretty quiet for the 2nd. Pickets have two main roles on a battlefield: to alert others on their side of the approach of enemy forces, and the second duty is to retard said approach. In the first duty, the 16th was rendered superfluous as the 2-hour artillery duel preceding the Confederate advance gave ample warning that something was coming. In the second duty, a single regiment would not have had the force necessary to stop said approach. Seeing this, Colonel Wheelock Graves Vesey wisely ordered the 16th to fall back and rejoin the rest of the 2nd. They rejoin, form up, and prepare to receive the Confederates. Just as Jimmy Campa's boys come into range, the 14th fires upon them. However, as they do this, Campa's boys wheeled towards the copse of trees. Everyone knows that feature, I'm not explaining it. They wheeled toward the copse of trees. Now, this was done because the Confederates were attempting to concentrate their force to break through the Union line. However, what this meant is that the southern end of the Confederate line was left in the air. Seeing a golden opportunity, Stannard orders the 13th and 16th regiments to flank the rebel lines. The 14th he leaves in place to maintain the Union line. So, you have the 14th staying, the others flanking, and that maintains cohesion even if it is a thin line there. Stannard also takes note that the Confederates haven't all charged. There are still some out in the other field, so that's another reason why he leaves the 14th in place. In all, about 900 Vermonters are now flanking the Confederates. Those 900 men go from where I'm standing currently nearly to the Cadore barn, which, although was taken before the Union forces had fallen back. They proceed to fire and advance. Fire and advance. They fire 12 volleys, and these volleys are devastating. So much so that the colonel of the 13th, Colonel Francis Voltaire Randall Sr., ran in front of his own men, waved his arms, and told them to cease fire. Pickett's charge was broken. Colonel Randall didn't want his men to fire on surrendering men. And some of these men at this point would be unarmed as they had even dropped their guns to run away quicker. A panic ensued. At least it had amongst the Confederates, and there's no need to waste ammunition firing on these men who are no longer a threat. So the 13th and 16th began taking prisoners and aiding the wounded. However, Colonel Wheelock Graves Vesey notices the Confederates forming to hit the Union line slightly below where the 14th is still holding. Seeing this, he orders his men back into the line of battle, and they, along with the 14th, wheel. This time, instead of wheeling to face north, they wheel to face south, and they fire into the ranks of Brigadier General Cadmus M. Wilcox. This leads to Wilcox also withdrawing and ensured the Union line held firm. For his actions that day, Colonel Wheelock Graves Vesey would receive a Medal of Honor September 8th, 1891. I don't know why. Like, in the other video, I was just talking about someone got one 30 years later. This one's only 28 years later, but still, it's ridiculous how long it takes these men to get medals sometimes. But he received it as he had rapidly assembled his regiment, charged the enemy's flank, charged front under heavy fire, and charged and destroyed a Confederate brigade all with new troops in their first battle. And regarding the heavy fire bit that I mentioned, I skipped over it earlier. However, during Pickett's charge, General Stannard actually received a leg wound from a piece of a rebel shell. It didn't end up getting amputated, but he did get a leg wound. However, he did stay on the field to command his men, not seeking medical attention until after both charges were done. In his after-action report, Major General Abner Doubleday, commander of the 1st Corps, would write of the 2nd Vermont, "I can only say that they performed perhaps the most brilliant feat during the war, for they broke the desperate charge of Pickett, saved the day, and with it, the whole North from invasion and devastation." Post-war, when giving a speech in 1866 in St. Albans, Vermont, General George Gordon Meade, the commander of the Army of the Potomac at the time of Gettysburg, said, "There was no individual body of men who rendered greater service at a critical moment than the comparatively raw troops commanded by General Stannard." These men had, certainly not single-handedly, but they had played a pivotal, you see, because they pivoted on the line of battle, that's the joke. They played a pivotal role in the stopping of Pickett's charge. Now, if Pickett's charge had broken through, does that mean a definite loss for the North entirely? I don't know. I don't do alternate history. But they played a very important role in the breaking of Pickett's charge. Remember, 400 men did get over the stone wall in Pickett's charge. They just weren't supported enough to maintain their breakthrough. And part of that is because there was flanking fire provided by the Vermonters that stopped enough men being able to force through. I expected this video to be longer, so I'm just going to add on a little bit at the end here. There's actually a controversy that I didn't go into. However, I guess I should note it. So, Stannard orders the 13th and 16th to wheel and fire on the flank of the Confederates. Immediately after he does this, he gets a messenger from Hancock, who, although Hancock is not his corps commander, he is an operational command of the line during Pickett's charge. He gets an order from Hancock, which says, "Hey, deploy your men on the flank." And Stannard just like looks at the messenger and goes, "Buddy, they're moving out now. I already ordered. What are you talking about?" And then Hancock comes down and sees it, and he talks to Stannard, but he's already done what he was going to be ordered to do before he receives the order. So there was a small controversy over whether Hancock gave the order or not. And although Hancock did give the order, the fact that it wasn't received until Stannard had already acted on his own initiative, Hancock eventually relented and went, "Okay, I guess I can't claim responsibility for Stannard's actions there." So yeah, that was a bit of controversy that I didn't do because I didn't go into it because I didn't want to muddy the waters for actual commands being given. But afterwards, I figured that's some additional information you guys might like to know. Speaking of additional information, Stannard's leg wound, though not needing an amputation, was still serious enough to remove him from the field, and Colonel Francis V. Randall of the 13th was raised to be the new Brigadier General for the 2nd Vermont Brigade. Post-battle, the 2nd Vermont took part in the initial pursuit of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. However, they only took part in the pursuit for about a week. They then were returned to Vermont. On their way home, elements, not the entire 2nd Vermont Brigade, elements participated in the quelling of the New York draft riots. Then, by August 10th, every man had been mustered out. This was not a long-serving regiment. They were there, they fought, they performed a great duty, as I mentioned earlier, and that was their end. I could end there, but I just want to say while I'm on the field and I'm at a relatively quiet spot currently, I mentioned it in my Maryland video 2 weeks ago, but if you look over there, you see the statue of the Brothers in Arms that I mentioned. And I believe that's a very touching monument. I've always had a soft spot for border states in the conflict because they would have much deeper ties, and you have the true sentiment there. I love the Vermont troops, but the decisions that had to be made when you were a border state had much harsher repercussions than choosing to fight if you're in a safe state. Like Vermont, obviously, you're going to fight for the Union, but with border states, you have that additional conflict. So it doesn't really relate to the rest of the video, but I just wanted to get that out there, and I can also now know that this video is a longer one like I promised, because that should bring me over my 16-minute mark. Okay.